Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a period of American history that doesn't just sit in textbooks. It echoes loudly, even nearly a century later.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're talking about the Great Depression spanning those, well, tumultuous years from 1929 to 1941.
And we're going to explore this incredibly complex era using a rich stack of sources, primarily drawing from Robert S. McElvaine's insightful book, The Great Depression, America, 1929–1941, along with some of his related writings.
Our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack this era for you. We want to understand not just what happened and the cold, hard causes, but also what it felt like to live through it.
Right, the human side.
Exactly. We'll look at the political responses and, crucially, figure out why, as McElvaine notes in these sources, no period in American history has more of importance to say to us now than does the Depression decade.
That point from the sources is key. McElvaine argues that the events and the way people and the government responded back then, well, they continue to shape our economic policies, our relationship with federal power, even the political divisions we see today.
What's particularly valuable about the approach in these sources is how it blends history from the top, the actions of government, elites, with history from the bottom.
Yeah, the experiences, struggles, social shifts among everyday people, you get this much fuller, richer picture.
Right.
Because, as the author suggests, time's profound crisis don't just test systems. They kind of strip things down and reveal deeper truths about our core values and what we truly believe about economics and society.
And that idea is going to be a thread running through everything we discussed today.
Definitely.
All right, let's unpack this by setting the scene. You might picture the 1920s as all roaring 20s, prosperity and fun. But what was really going on beneath that surface, according to our sources?
Well, the sources paint a more complex picture. Yes, there was surface prosperity, sure, but the economy was undergoing a pretty fundamental transformation.
How so?
For centuries, the focus had been on production, how to make enough stuff. John Stuart Mill thought if you could just produce enough, consumption would handle itself. But the 20s flipped that entirely.
Oh.
The economy became driven by consumption.
And that meant advertising wasn't just about selling things anymore. It was about actually creating demand, telling people to spend.
Exactly. The sources share this incredible quote from Simon Patton telling his students way back in 1907, even before the 20s, "The non-saver is now a higher type than the saver. I tell my students to spend all they have and borrow more and spend that."
Wow. That's quite a shift in thinking.
It really is,
Yeah.
from thrift as a virtue to spending as a virtue.
Yeah.
And the automobile absolutely symbolized this new mass consumption.
Right. The car.
The number of cars on the road just exploded, jumping from fewer than 7 million to over 23 million in that decade. It wasn't just luxury anymore. It was becoming a perceived necessity.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing into a modern age, was it? There was this real cultural paradox.
Definitely. A love for the dazzling new consumer goods, sure, but also a strong pushback from rural and traditional values. The sources describe it as a many-fronted war. Things like the rise of the Ku Klux Klan or the, intense fight over prohibition laws.
And the sources suggest that turning to the law for things like prohibition was almost an admission of defeat.
Yeah, kind of. Like the old moral code wasn't sufficient anymore on its own. If traditional values were strong enough, you wouldn't necessarily need federal laws to make people behave a certain way, right?
Makes sense. So who wasn't benefiting from this seemingly widespread prosperity? Who wasn't exactly roaring?
Farmers, for one, shared the least in the prosperity. They were already committed to progressive government programs, seeking help, and were burdened by massive debt.
How bad was the debt?
Farm mortgages more than doubled from 1910 to 1920, and then another $2.7 billion was added in the early 20s. So they were really vulnerable to structural issues like overproduction, weather.
That's a tough spot.
Yeah. And industrial workers, too. Despite having access to some consumer goods, the sources quote a labor historian saying their economic reality felt more like nickel or copper or perhaps even tin, but certainly not gold.
So precarious work.
Very. A study in Muncie, Indiana found that even in 1923, considered a good year, over a quarter of the sampled workers had been laid off at some point. Layoffs were just, well, part of the landscape.
And what about the government's role in all this? President Coolidge is often seen as pretty hands-off.
He was, maybe, but figures like Herbert Hoover at Commerce and especially Andrew Mellon at Treasury were very active.
By Andrew Mellon, one of
Yeah.
the wealthiest men in America. His goal, the sources say, was reducing the tax burden on the rich.
And he was incredibly effective. The Revenue Act of 1926 drastically cut taxes for the wealthy. Someone making $1 million saw their taxes just plummet.
And there were refunds, too.
Yes, the sources mentioned $3.5 billion in administrative tax refunds between 1921 and 1929, often going to corporations and individuals considered friendly to the Republican Party. Wow. And then there's that almost unbelievable scheme the sources describe involving DuPont and Raskob.
Oh, yeah. It's quite something. They believed the productive, wealthy shouldn't pay high taxes. The working class should.
So what was the plan?
Their idea, according to the sources, was to take over the Democratic Party, repeal prohibition, then tax beer, the working man's drink, to raise maybe $1.3 billion
They use that money.
to fund a further 50% cut in corporate and individual taxes for the rich. They genuinely saw this as a reasonable trade-off. It's quite revealing about the mindset.
Beer for tax cuts for the rich. It really highlights a critical structural weakness the sources point to. This severe maldistribution of income in the 1920s.
Absolutely. The Brookings Institution did this startling study in 1929 showing the top more 0.1% of families had an aggregate income equal to the bottom 42%.
So let me get that straight.
Mhm.
0.1% had the same as the bottom 42%.
Yeah. We're talking about roughly 24,000 families having as much income as 11.5 million poorer families combined, and 71% of all families had incomes under $2,500. Income inequality was dramatically increasing.
That's not just a number. The insight here is that such extreme income concentration created a structural weakness, right? Made the economy incredibly fragile.
Exactly. Dependent on the spending and investment of a tiny elite. When the crash hit them, the bottom fell out for everyone because the vast majority just didn't have the income to sustain demand.
The sources even mention a New York Times ad.
Right, offering water rights in the city as a symbol of the era's values. The idea of charging millions for water from a single well was enough to excite investors. Speaks volumes.
And this environment was the perfect breeding ground for this speculative boom.
Totally. The idea that it was easy to get rich quick, seen earlier in the Florida land boom, just moved to the stock market. RCA stock, which had never paid a dividend, its price jumped from 85 to 420 just in 1928.
So people were buying based on momentum, not value.
Purely momentum, not the underlying value of the company at all.
The sources mentioned the Fed lowered rates in 1927. Did that cause it?
Well, it certainly made borrowing for speculation easier, but the sources argue it wasn't the root cause. The real driver was that widespread belief in easy wealth and the huge pool of excess capital at the top looking for high returns.
And underlying all of this was the dominant intellectual climate. Classical economics, laissez-faire.
A strong belief in it, yeah. The idea was that economic problems were almost like natural phenomena beyond human influence, guided by Adam Smith's invisible hand.
Which led to what the sources call amoral marketplace economics.
Right. The belief that morality really has no place in the natural workings of the market.
And this view made it easy to justify indifference to those who failed.
Pretty much. The sources quote the president of the University of Wisconsin during an earlier panic, saying suffering often came from improvidence, from extravagance, or from dissipation. The implication being if the market is perfect, you only lose if it's your own fault.
Which brings us, inevitably, to the trigger point. The stock market crash in October 1929. J.K. Galbraith famously said nothing was lost but money.
True, but as our sources note, given the values of the day, that was everything for many people.
So the crash itself wasn't the sole cause of the depression.
No, the roots were in all those structural weaknesses we just discussed, but it hit confidence hard. It undercut the spending and investment of the very group the fragile economy depended on.
And then things spiraled.
Yeah, industrial production, imports, they dropped sharply right after the crash. The downward spiral began. The depression was underway.
So how did President Herbert Hoover respond? The sources highlight that he didn't just wait around like maybe predecessors did.
No, he actually believed action could make a difference. He had this strong confidence in human ability organization. His initial response was quite active, actually.
Like what?
He sought a voluntary partnership. Business, labor, government. Held conferences, got employers to pledge to maintain wages. He even tried to encourage Americans to reverse that thrift tradition and spend the nation back to prosperity.
But then, the sources describe a shift. He initially increased public works, but later fiercely opposed direct federal relief bills.
Yeah, calling them an unexampled raid on the public treasury. He argued, we cannot thus squander ourselves into prosperity. They call this the emergence of a new Hoover.
So his core principle was,
Government as a catalyst for voluntary cooperative action within the private sector. Things like the Federal Farm Board or the National Business Survey Conference were attempts to make this voluntarism work nationally.
and how did that go?
While the sources show they failed pretty spectacularly, the Farm Board lost money, angered farmers. The Business Survey Conference's main product, optimism, well, it simply could not be moved by 1931, according to the sources.
Why did they fail?
Ultimately, due to the sheer enormity of the economic disaster, voluntarism just wasn't enough to overcome that kind of collapse. The sources even note Hoover later omitted mentioning the MBSC from his memoirs.
Ouch. A telling omission.
Yeah, perhaps a sign of its perceived failure.
Politically, this was bad news for Republicans, right? The 1930 midterms.
Very bad. They suffered their worst losses since 1922, which, interestingly, was also a year of economic slump.
And the crisis just deepened after that.
It did. Hoover's attempt in late 1931 to balance the budget through retrenchment actually made the Depression worse in 1932. By then, administration leaders were starting to grasp the true scale, but it felt like maybe it was too late.
People were judging policies by results.
And the results were more jobs lost, more suffering. The sources share this stark quote from Chicago's mayor telling Congress they had a choice: send federal relief or send troops.
Grim. So by the 1932 Republican Convention,
The sources describe very little genuine enthusiasm for Hoover. It felt like a retreat. They note the only enthusiasm seemed to come from beyond the grave, referencing a supposed message from Lincoln endorsing him.
and this is the context where Franklin D. Roosevelt emerges. People were desperate, looking for a different kind of leader. A hero figure, almost.
Exactly.
His background is interesting. The sources note he wasn't purely academic at Harvard, and failing to get into that elite Porcellian club may be a good thing.
Some observers thought so. Yeah, might have reduced any sense of elitism. In his early career, losing the VP bid in 1920, he secured the presidential nomination despite some reluctance. Boss Murphy famously said something like, "I don't like Roosevelt, but I would vote for the devil himself if Cox wanted me to."
But a pivotal moment, the sources really emphasize, was his illness, polio.
Profoundly changed him, yes. He went from a carefree playboy, as described, to someone much more inwardly serious.
Francis Perkins is quoted.
Saying, "The man emerged completely warm-hearted, with humility of spirit. Having been to the depths of trouble, he understood the problems of people in trouble. His earlier patrician sense of stewardship became a more genuine compassion.
He had this incredible political style, the democratic patrician,
A blend of warmth and power. People really responded to it.
and he was a master communicator.
Yeah.
A huge contrast to Hoover.
Massive. Where Hoover couldn't credibly restore hope, Roosevelt's famous "nothing to fear but fear itself" just resonated deeply. People listened. They believed him.
Will Rogers quote.
Yeah, capturing the mood. The whole country is with him, just so he does something. If he burned down the Capitol, we would cheer and say, well, we at least got a fire started anyhow. That sums up the desperation for action.
It's fascinating, according to the sources, how his most vocal enemies actually helped him politically.
It is ironic, isn't it? Conservative businessmen, Republicans, people like Al Smith's wealthy backers, the Liberty League, they absolutely detested Roosevelt, called him radical, accused him of seeking redistribution of income.
And that opposition.
Paradoxically, it convinced many struggling citizens that he must be their champion. The sources include this letter from an Indiana admirer who liked FDR precisely because his most bitter opponents are the rich, the chambers of commerce, principally the manufacturers. Their attacks became this powerful, unintended endorsement.
So he steps into the presidency facing just a catastrophic situation. What was the immediate crisis right at inauguration?
The banking system was collapsing nationwide. The Pecora investigation had just exposed the extreme greed and, frankly, the startling weakness within the system.
Banks were failing even in the 20s.
Nearly 7,000 had failed then. And crucially, strong banks weren't helping weaker ones. They saw them as bad banks that should just fail. No solidarity there.
So FDR's first move was the bank holiday. Bold.
Immediate and bold. And interestingly, he consulted even with the leading money changers, as the sources put it, on how to fix things.
But his genius was connecting with the public. That first fireside chat.
Absolutely key. He explained banking simply, reassured people that the bank's reopening would be sound, and people believed him. When they reopened, deposits exceeded withdrawals.
Amazing. And the stock market reacted.
Saw its largest one-day increase in history after that chat. The sources quote Raymond Molley dramatically saying capitalism was saved in 8 days, largely attributing it to the magic of Roosevelt's radio oratory.
And Washington started buzzing. People flocked there.
Thousands of ambitious, idealistic young people. The sources call it a rare moment when ambition and idealism aligned. These were the foot soldiers of the New Deal.
Okay, so what was their initial economic strategy to tackle this huge problem?
FDR's initial focus, according to the sources, was really on increasing agricultural income, mostly through the AAA. He also believed inflation and modest federal spending were necessary.
Inflation to counter deflation.
Right. Monetarism, managing the currency to create inflation, was seen as a way to offset deflation and boost farm income. That view was reflected in the Thomas Amendment.
And the key first New Deal programs that rolled out,
Mm-hmm.
they were trying to please different groups,
Seemed that way, yeah. Addressing specific urgent problems, trying to build broad support,
like the NRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act. That was central.
seen as the centerpiece, yeah. It aimed for this business government reform, giving industry power to create codes of fair competition. In return, it promised labor reforms, minimum wage, maximum hours, end child labor, and Section 7A for collective bargaining.
Though that bargaining part was tricky.
Yeah, Section 7A was often circumvented by businesses, and the sources note a strange boomlet in summer 33 before the codes kicked in.
A boomlet.
Manufacturers basically built up inventory using cheap labor before the anticipated higher wages and demand after the codes, which unfortunately led to a wave of re-unemployment later. So mixed results, though it did help labor organizing long term. Then there was the PWA, the Public Works Administration, led by Honest Harold Ikes.
His focus was on value, not just spending.
Exactly. Ikes was determined money be spent on valuable, lasting public projects. The sources praised the PWA's incredible record of efficient use of funds and near-zero scandal.
And its legacy is visible, right? Bridges, dams.
Huge legacy. Grand Coulee Dam, Triborough Bridge, and they build roughly 70% of all new educational buildings in the U.S. between 33 and 39. It really helped people and improved the nation's infrastructure, avoiding a lot of the criticism other programs faced.
And for the middle class facing foreclosures.
The Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC. It refinanced up to 20% of urban mortgages at low rates. Critics said it helped lenders more, maybe, but it undeniably brought relief to homeowners and secured crucial middle-class support for Roosevelt.
It's easy to get lost in the policies, the acronyms. But the sources really emphasize the human experience. What was it like day to day, that view from below?
A powerful way to see that is through the letters people wrote directly to the Roosevelts, desperately asking for help.
What did they see him as?
A distant, powerful, but deeply compassionate figure. The sources say almost like a sanctified king, or Moses. A Georgia man addressed him as Your Royalty, Majesty. Just reveals this deep trust and, frankly, desperation.
But seeking help itself.
Mm.
It came with a cost, didn't it? The indignity of relief.
A heavy emotional cost, yeah. The sources describe the long waits in public assistance offices, the intrusive, sometimes humiliating questions, the visits from caseworkers checking up on you. A feeling of shame, degradation, becoming something anonymous who will presently be more or less fed.
That's rough. And the emotional progression.
This initial shame often gave way to despair and then a kind of crushing apathy. The sources share quotes like a youth asking, "Why the hell should I get up in the morning, lady?" Or in Fair Investigator describing people as terrifyingly patient.
Patient, but maybe
Oh.
broken.
Yeah, a supervisor noted people were sick mentally and physically, given up even trying. It really speaks to the psychological toll.
Did that apathy ever turn to resentment?
Sometimes, yeah. As self-blame faded, resentment grew, often directed at the system or the caseworkers themselves, especially maybe young, well-off college women acting as investigators.
There's an example from California.
Yeah, an investigator visiting clients in a very elegant riding costume, and a Georgia woman complaining that caseworkers never have felt the sting of hunger, a real disconnect.
How did this impact families, specifically men and women?
The impact was significant. The sources note mothers' roles, being less tied to outside status and paid work, were often less disrupted internally than fathers, whose identity was so profoundly linked to their job, their role as provider.
Steinbeck's quote from Grapes of Wrath.
Right. Woman can change better than a man, Ma said soothingly. Woman got all her life in her arms, man got it all in his head. Captures that idea.
But mothers still suffered immensely.
Oh, absolutely. Described as hearing her hungry babe whimpering or crying herself to sleep. And some wives had to take on roles traditionally held by men, even making big decisions without their unemployed husbands.
What about children? How did they experience it?
Interestingly, the sources suggest children were largely free from the self-blame and shame common among adults. They kind of knew the problems weren't their fault.
So, with all this immense human suffering and the economic breakdown, how did the crisis affect fundamental American values?
Mm.
The sources stress that values aren't fixed, they can change.
Yeah, they contrast that amoral marketplace economics we saw in the 20s where morality is out, property rights are everything, indifference to the losers.
With a new push towards moral economics, what's that?
Basically, the argument that the economy should be organized with morality in mind, with a concern for human suffering, for the well-being of others.
And the 1930s saw a definite shift away from that self-centered, acquisitive individualism.
Clearly, that ethos was seen not just as bad morals, but as FDR put it, bad economics, too. The crisis fostered a move towards cooperation, sharing, concern for others. As FDR said in his second inaugural, economic morality pays.
And you see this shift reflected in the culture, films, for instance.
Absolutely. Think of Frank Capra or John Ford films. Common people are the heroes. Bankers, the wealthy, frequently portrayed as selfish villains.
Stagecoach is mentioned as a key example.
Classic example. The character seen as lowlife's the gambler, the prostitute turned out to be decent, selfless. The respectable banker, he's shown as crooked, selfish, a coward, literally running off with stolen money while spouting lines about what's good for the banks is good for the country.
Directly reflecting that anti-elite sentiment.
Exactly. Pro-common person. And public
Right.
opinion studies from the time back this up, too.
Like the Chicago survey.
Yeah. 1936 found strong alignment between lower income and middle income residents on things like wealth distribution, the undue influence of businessmen. 80% of lower income, 69% of middle income agreed businessmen had too much influence. Only 7% of the wealthy agreed.
So people knew what they liked and disliked, even without fancy terms.
Pretty much, they rejected greed and egoism.
The sources also proposed this fascinating feminization effect. Can you explain that?
Well, the idea is that the self-centered, aggressive male ethic of the booming 1920s became discredited. Men lost jobs, became dependent in ways previously associated more with women.
Like those early Depression films showing women forced into dependence.
Right, or even prostitution to survive. That reflected a vulnerability many men felt by 1932. It led to a rejection of the purely success-oriented life, a feeling of passivity, maybe even a willingness to prostitute themselves economically just to survive.
And this connects to values like fairness and morality rising.
The sources suggest so. That rise in values like fairness and morality, seen later in polls showing a gender gap, might have roots in this Depression-era shift, where traditional definitions of male strength and success were really challenged.
Okay, so as the Depression dragged on, by 34, 35, pressure was building on the New Deal to move further left. The sources call it thunder on the left.
Yeah, definitely building. Worker unrest was a major driver. The NRA's promise of steady employment hadn't really materialized, which fueled militant organizing.
There were examples given.
Oh, yeah. The violent Minneapolis Teamsters strike, the San Francisco General Strike, where workers used non-violence to protest official violence and eventually won control of hiring halls. Attitudes were hardening. People were fighting back.
And there were these powerful alternative voices attracting huge followings.
Huge. Minnesota Governor Olson, Farmer Labor Party, talking about needing not just a new deal, but also a new deck, almost socialist.
Father Charles Coughlin.
The radio priest. Millions of listeners. Focused on monetary reforms, wealth redistribution, wanting to inject Christianity into the economic system.
Dr. Francis Townsend and his pension plan.
Hugely popular among the elderly, focused on boosting consumption through direct payments. A powerful lobby.
And then Huey Long, the kingfish.
Yeah, with his Share Our Wealth Society. He felt the New Deal wasn't doing enough for the common folk. Aimed to break up large fortunes, spread the wealth, using really fiery language, calling the rich pigs swilling. Very popular.
But could these leaders unite?
The sources suggest probably not. Despite pointing to similar public values, fairness, better wealth distribution, their potential to unite was limited, partly by their leaders' sheer vanity, as one quote puts it.
But these movements served as a warning siren for FDR.
Absolutely. His popularity among workers was actually declining by 1935. Figures like Martha Gellhorn felt betrayed, wondering how people were supposed to live on so little relief. He needed to regain that support.
So this pressure led to a strategic pivot. He moved left.
He did, yeah. Adopted a more fighting rhetoric, framing the 1936 election as us against them.
And this strategic shift drove the key Second New Deal legislation in 1935.
Exactly. Like the Social Security Act, perhaps the most enduring piece, passed somewhat reluctantly by FDR, actually.
Reluctantly. Why?
Well, it had flaws, initially excluded some of the neediest workers, took money out of circulation initially through payroll taxes, but politically it was vital in securing long-term support for him.
And the Wagner Act, National Labor Relations Act.
Called perhaps the most important law passed in the 1930s by the sources. Again, interestingly, FDR was a bit hesitant. He preferred doing for workers rather than empowering them directly through collective bargaining.
But it fundamentally changed things for labor.
Oh, absolutely. Set the stage for effective collective bargaining power.
And the WPA, Works Progress Administration.
A massive work relief program. Preferred over direct handouts, the dole. Harry Hopkins, who ran it, put it memorably. The dole might save his body, but a job would save both body and spirit.
What did it build?
Enormous amounts of infrastructure, roads, bridges, buildings, though it faced criticism, of course, as make work and fears of political control, political subservience.
A fascinating part of the WPA was the arts projects, federal one.
Yeah, aimed to provide suitable relief for unemployed professionals, artists, musicians, writers, actors. It was also seen as this attempt to bring high culture to ordinary people, fuse it with democracy.
The Federal Theater Project sounds particularly interesting and controversial.
It was the most controversial, shortest-lived. Its director, Hallie Flanagan, aimed for a national theater providing food for thought, raising social awareness, promised it would be free, adult, uncensored.
They did living newspapers.
Yeah, dramatized documentaries on contemporary issues, agriculture, utilities, courts, property rights. Very innovative, but led to charges of propaganda, communism.
And the Voodoo Macbeth story.
Right, in Harlem, directed by Orson Welles, reportedly used real goats for authenticity, highlights the ambition and maybe the sometimes controversial nature of these projects.
So the political outcome of 1936.
Clearly showed class as the dominant factor. Voters supported FDR because overwhelmingly they felt he helped the working classes. Simple as that.
And the rise of the CIO during this time.
Remarkable success. Organizing millions of previously unorganized industrial workers, John L. Lewis of the mine workers is even called Moses leading them.
But there's a paradox there.
Yeah.
The CIO helped capitalism.
It's an interesting point from the sources. The CIO managed worker discontent, channeled it into directions acceptable within the capitalist system. It helped resuscitate capitalism by giving workers more purchasing power, stability. But then, a revived, powerful capitalism ultimately constrained, even devitalized the CIO over the long term as union leaders became less militant, more integrated.
Moving into FDR's second term, he had this huge mandate, but things got tougher domestically.
Yeah, his ability to push through domestic reforms became more challenging. Several factors.
Like congressional opposition.
Growing opposition, yeah. Fueled by resentment of presidential power and the formation of that conservative coalition, Southern Democrats and Republicans working together.
And the court fight didn't help.
No, his attempt to reorganize the Supreme Court really damaged political trust and solidified that opposition. Plus, his attempt to purge conservative Democrats in the 38 primaries backfired badly, weakened his standing with Congress.
Then came the 1937 recession, a major setback.
Huge setback. The economy seemed to be recovering, but FDR cut WPA rules too soon, the Fed tightened credit, all while unemployment was still high, led to a new economic collapse. A clear policy mistake.
How did the 1938 elections go?
Badly for the Democrats. Lost governorships, Senate seats, House seats. Voters blamed the party in power for the renewed downturn.
But did the underlying desire for government action disappear?
Not entirely. The sources note Democrats held on to support among lower-income groups. And tellingly, many winning Republicans in 38 actually had to shift left to get elected. Some even endorsed the Townsend Plan. Shows voters were frustrated, but maybe not rejecting the New Deal principles entirely.
So the New Deal didn't really end with a bang. It just sort of faded away.
Pretty much. World War II became the dominant focus. The sources argue foreign policy became almost an escape from those tough domestic problems. The war itself didn't cause the abandonment of reform ideas, though.
But the war environment changed things.
It killed some of that spirit of shared sacrifice from the Depression, yeah. Conservatives, big business regained influence, and many New Deal agencies just expired.
Looking back, Hoover versus Roosevelt. What's the core difference the sources highlight?
The key difference, they suggest, is Hoover the ideologue versus Roosevelt the pragmatist. Hoover was concerned with consistency, sticking to his principles of limited government, voluntarism,
Anna Roosevelt.
eclectic, a common-sense idealist. His success is linked, according to the sources, to his pragmatism allowing him to adapt, his own beliefs coinciding with those shifting popular values, and his opportunism, his ability to sense and conform to the popular will.
And it's striking how this history echoes more recently. The sources mention parallels.
Clear parallels in the lead up to economic collapses, like 1987-2008. Both followed periods of conservative dominance, policies aimed at restoring conditions that, well, eerily resemble the 1920s.
They contrast the responses, too.
Yeah. The typical response from the market god faithful in later crises, basically, keep following the regimen that produced the sickness, sticking to deregulation, tax cuts versus FDR's call for bold, persistent experimentation.
And what about the legacy of Keynesianism, the idea you can spend your way out of a depression?
Well, the lesson many drew from WWII's full employment was warfare means prosperity. Military spending certainly helped the post-WWII economy.
But only half the lesson was learned.
That's what the sources argue. Spending became politically popular. But the necessary counterpoint tightening fiscal policy when the economy overheated to prevent inflation, bubbles that never really gained political traction.
Like the Reagan deficits.
Yeah, massive deficit spending even when growth was relatively low. It shows that political asymmetry.
And comparing values across eras, post-WWII saw a return to individualism.
Dominated by acquisitive individualism, yeah. A self-centered ethic of consumption, pushed heavily by media, advertising. Style as the highest value. Enormous pressure to live beyond your means, emulate the rich.
Which is the complete opposite of the values gaining ground during the Depression.
Totally opposed. That shift towards cooperation, fairness, concern for suffering. The sources even use the term social Calvinism for that later mindset. Successful are the elect, unemployed, the damned, helps justify indifference, a stark contrast to the Depression era move towards shared fate.
It really reinforces the source's point that economic beliefs aren't just pure science.
They're often deep-seated dogma rooted in core values.
So wrapping up this deep dive, what have we learned from these sources? The Great Depression wasn't just a sudden event.
No, it was a complex crisis born from accumulating structural weaknesses like extreme income inequality, speculative excess amplified by a dominant economic dogma that resisted intervention.
It created immense human suffering, but that crisis also revealed and fundamentally shifted some core American values.
Right. Moving away from pure, often indifferent individualism towards a greater sense of cooperation and a desire for what the sources call economic morality.
The political responses under Hoover, then FDR, reflected these different philosophies and led to the bold, sometimes messy, innovations of the New Deal.
Which in turn faced strong opposition, evolved, and eventually faded as the focus shifted to global conflict.
And understanding this history isn't just academic, is it? It provides essential context for today.
Absolutely. For understanding contemporary economic challenges, seeing the patterns and recurring cycles of boom, collapse, and importantly, value shifts.
It makes you really consider those fundamental beliefs about the relationship between people, government, and the market. When you look at these recurring cycles, the pendulum swings between individualistic and more cooperative values. What does a time of crisis truly reveal about what we believe at our core?
And maybe how might understanding these deeper, sometimes hidden value systems help us navigate future economic challenges differently, maybe more effectively than relying purely on economic models alone.
A powerful question to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.